Welcome to the first panel of the United Nations Study Program tonight on the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goal. This panel is sponsored by the Economic and Political Development Concentration. They are there. I want to thank them for their support in organizing the panel. I also want to extend a very warm welcome to the first-year student tonight, and of course to the second year. I hope to see you, many of you, during our retreat this weekend on global governance and the United Nations, which is really continuing the discussion that we are going to have tonight on the MDGs. 10 years ago, exactly 10 years ago, in September 2000 at the Millennium Summit, we made a promise to the poorest of the poor. And we set very ambitious goals. And we wanted to reach the goals by 2015. So we have 5 years left. And the world joined together in 2000 and promised to fight poverty, hunger, disease, illiteracy. And we promised that we would reduce extreme poverty and hunger by half in 2015. That children everywhere could go and have primary school and there would be no gender impediment in education. That the maternal mortality would be reduced by 3/4. We promised to develop a global partnership for development and to push a reversal of HIV, AIDS, and other diseases like malaria, and much more. So 5 years from the goals, where are we? What have we achieved? What lessons have we learned in 10 years? What are the gaps? Can we keep the promise? Can we uphold the dream? We know there have been problems. We know there have been huge challenges. The effect of climate change, the financial crisis, the food crisis. And we know that each time, it is always the bottom billion who take the brunt. Next week, more than 150 heads of state and government, foreign ministers, kings, private sector, civil society, activist groups will come to the United Nations at a summit on the MDGs. And they will announce new initiatives. They will rededicate themselves to the goals of the MDGs. But can we make it? What is it that we need in the 5 years to come to do that we haven't done to reach that goal? And to translate the commitments into action. To discuss all this tonight, we have a number of speakers that I would like to introduce to you. Kandeh Yumkella is the Director General of UNIDO. For those who don't know what UNIDO is doing, it's a specialized agency of the United Nations who help countries attain sustainable industrial development. Kandeh Yumkella is the first Director General who comes from sub-Sahara Africa, being from Sierra Leone. And he knows a lot about jobs and the lack of jobs in his country and poverty and civil wars. He is a scholar. He's chairing important groups at the United Nations. One is the high-level group, which advises the Secretary General on energy and climate change challenges. But he is also chairing the interagency mechanism known as the UN Energy. I want to extend to him a very warm welcome. I think he's coming to SIPA for the first time. And he's coming right from the airport, from Vienna, where his headquarters is located, to talk to you tonight. And he has in front of him a huge week, because he will be in the 53 events that the United Nations is going to organize. So, thank you. Nafis Sadik is the special envoy for HIV/AIDS in Asia. She has been appointed by Kofi Annan in that position, but was also appointed by the current Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. She was previously at the head of UNFPA, and she has written extensively about population issues. She's a formidable woman, and she's a friend. Thank you for coming, Nafis. Jomo Sundaram, who is from Malaysia, but I always think he's from Kenya because of his name, is a prominent economist. He's an assistant secretary general at the United Nations in the Department of Economic Development and Social Affairs. He's a leading scholar and expert on political economy and development, especially in Southern Asia. He's an outspoken intellectual. He very often does not agree with other people, which is good for us. He has written extensively. He has come to SIPA before, and second year may remember him in one of our panels, and I want to welcome him again. Rebeca Grynspan has not arrived, and I will introduce her when she arrives, but maybe I should tell you so that I don't interrupt the panel. She's the associate administrator of UNDP, which means she's the number 2 of UNDP. And it's the first time that UNDP has at its head 2 women. And that is exciting. Helen Clark and Rebeca are really heading UNDP. And they will tell you a lot about the role of women in development. She's a scholar. She has worked a lot on the MDGs, and she was the vice prime minister of Costa Rica. So she will probably talk about also what do the MDGs mean for middle countries. Last but not least, Bob Orr, who is an assistant secretary general for policy coordination and strategic planning in the office of the secretary general. Before he came to the UN, he was at Harvard University. He has worked in many senior posts in the US government. He has published extensively on the subject that we are discussing tonight. He's an old colleague, and I want to welcome him too. As a matter of fact, I will give the floor to him first, because Bob, I would like you to explain to us the political context and the financial context in which we are starting this discussion next week at the UN. We know that the heads of state are going to sign a declaration or adapt a declaration. We would like to know what are the new initiatives they are going to propose, what is ahead of us next week, how do you see it, what is the politics of the MDGs right now? So you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Elisabeth, and thank you for not only the invitation, but these days at the UN, we're in the business of mobilization of leadership at the UN around this subject. I can see you've been doing a little bit of mobilizing yourself. I love seeing a room on the MDGs that has people sitting on the windowsill. So thank you to all of you, even if you don't have a seat. This is an extraordinary exercise in mobilizing political will around subjects that, even in the best of times, are ones that people would prefer to look away from. If you look at what the MDGs are, it's basically a compact of minimal standards of living and decency around the world in areas that we generally don't do very well. In order to give you a context of what's about to happen next week, it's probably worth just taking a very quick trip back to 2000 when the goals grew out of the Millennium Summit, which was an attempt to look at the entire agenda of the UN looking forward into the new millennium. What's interesting is at the time, the Millennium Declaration was probably better known for a lot of the elements that came in other areas of the UN's competence. On the peace and security side, human rights. But if you asked anyone today what the Millennium Summit did or was about, they would answer the Millennium Development Goals. So the fact that development not only came out of the pack, but came to lead the pack in terms of what came out of the future-looking exercise, it's an interesting political story. I won't get into it, but I think it's worth going back to 2000, because one of the pieces of what this exercise is next week is taking stock of 10 hard years of work on the Millennium Development Goals, having incorporated a lot of the lessons of what's worked and not worked to achieve these 8 very important goals in all parts of the world. We have a short 5 years left. So what was already a tough kind of sprint when you looked at it over a 15-year time frame, in a 5-year time frame, becomes almost unbearably pressing, the needs that have to be met in 5 short years. This exercise next week is all about getting political leaders not just to recommit themselves, and in this case, it actually bears noting that the heads of state that passed the original Millennium Declaration, if you look at the list with the list that will be here next week, there may be no more, I would guess, than 4 or 5 of those 130, 140, 150 heads of state that we will see were actually in office back then. So it's not just a recommitment of nations' efforts, but it's actually a commitment by the world's leaders today to a sprint to the finish on these Millennium Development Goals. You have before you a range of true experts on the Millennium Development Goals, so I don't want to dig into the substance of the goals themselves, because I think the people in front of you will do that best. But I would like to flag kind of the political framework of this. It's no surprise, it's no secret to anyone that this is the worst possible time you could be trying to raise money for poor people. There could not be a worse time. There's not a government that is not pleading poverty. There is not a company that's not shedding people. There is not an actor that we're trying to mobilize out there that feels like they're on very stable ground right now. So why would we be doing this? Is it just the accident of the calendar that somehow we said, oh, year 10, we got to do something with 5 years left? No, it is very much about taking this very hard current climate and reminding the leaders of the world that there will be no recovery for the world, and certainly no sustainable recovery, if the poorest and the most disenfranchised people around the world are not dealt into this recovery. The tendency to want to build on strengths and ride the strong horses is palpable right now. What we have to remind everyone is that if we have learned anything in this exercise, is that investing in the poorer and most disenfranchised parts of our population is the basis not just of prosperity and morality, if you will, in the public sphere, but also of other goods that government leaders want: stability, security. So this is the time to talk about those who do not have what they need to have. It is the time to take stock of what we've learned from 10 years of experience. There is a very varied tableau of what we've learned about the goals, and I think you'll hear some of the dimensions of that tonight from our other speakers. But I said that at this moment there is a strong tendency to want to ride the strong horses. If there was one kind of trend in discussions about the goals before the crisis, it was how well we were doing, that we've made so much progress. If you subtract China and India out of the equation, all of a sudden the numbers don't look so good. So we don't want to engage in a fictitious exercise here, that somehow we want to claim credit for things that, a couple countries have done. In fact, we've seen progress in many countries. But if you take it in the aggregate, the numbers, if you're talking about the poorest people of the world, China and India move mountains. So if they're doing well, the aggregate looks good. But we have to resist the temptation to just ride the strong horses. We really have to go after the hardest issues and the hardest people to reach in the hardest places. And this is not just as a matter of conviction. It's a matter of practicality. I'll just give one example. The slowest moving of the MDGs has been the maternal health goal. If you tried to pick an MDG that was maybe one of the worst ones to move the slowest, that would probably be it. When mothers die in the birthing process, it's not only an incredible sad event and a waste of human resources, but the ripple effects of the loss of mothers is tremendous across all the goals. In fact, from all the data we have, when a mother dies, her children are 10 times more likely to die prematurely. 10 times more likely. So the ripple effects go into the millions of people when the now 350,000 women a year die needlessly in the process of childbirth. Until recently, we were saying 500,000. But the new numbers have come in that we have managed in recent years to reduce maternal mortality from 500,000 needless deaths a year to 350. But far from patting ourselves on the back, that's exactly 350,000 deaths too many. But it is not just women's health that we need to take aim at. There are other difficult goals on sanitation in particular that are not moving well. Again, the ripple effects and the cost of addressing issues in the maternal and child health space and on sanitation is incredibly low. So if you take kind of a political approach to this, as well as a pragmatic approach, we not only have to go after the lagging targets as a matter of kind of moral responsibility, but also because of the ripple effects that those cost-effective investments will have across all the MDGs and across the entire development paradigm. One final word about this exercise next week. Elisabeth mentioned the number of heads of state. For 3 days, the fact that we have leaders of the world focusing on these questions for 3 days is really quite remarkable. The UN, as you know, is a gathering place every year in the fall. And now virtually every year there is a summit of one sort or of another. Last year, climate change. The year before that, we also looked at MDGs. The year before that, we in fact have not 53 events next week, but we have 83 side events. Or Jomo, is it more now? 83, I think, during the MDG summit. This has become the gathering place not just for speech making of leaders. It's for gathering all the critical actors around the issues. So if you want to know what the state of the art is on what we're doing on malaria, what we, the world, are doing on malaria, there's a side event. On women and children's health, there's a side event. You can go through individual parts of the Millennium Development Goals, they're there. Of course, we also have a number of summits on Sudan, on Somalia, on Myanmar, so on the other side, Pakistan, on the entire range of issues that are burning, or some of which are not burning enough on the current agenda. But to think about, as you are all here under the aegis of the UN Affairs Program at SIPA, another reason I like to see this room full is that you happen to be in a city now that really is the center of the world for a few days here, where not just the leaders of governments are coming, but the leaders of the corporate sector, the leaders of the nonprofit sector and civil society, the leaders of philanthropy. And the UN has become the place where we try to broker the relationships that are necessary to address really difficult problems like the MDGs. Some of the most exciting things that will happen next week won't be from governments. It will be from some of the other actors that are getting in for real. Governments have to lead on this. There is a burden of leadership, and there's no question that having world leaders here is the place to start. But it's not the sum total. It's not just for having good speeches and commitments. It is about doing, and about the partnerships that will come out of it and the concrete work that will come out. And in that regard, the kinds of new commitments we'll see next week on the issue that I just mentioned on women's and children's health are going to be quite exciting. So at a time when it's hard for anyone to get excited about the economic situation in the world, and certainly the economic and social situation for the poorest and most vulnerable, we actually do have some good news. So one of the things that we have to do is build momentum around what we are succeeding on and what we are starting to see promise in, but at the same time take aim at the gaps and the things that we haven't been able to achieve, and in the hardest places where we haven't been able to achieve it. So thank you for coming tonight. We do appreciate your interest in the UN more broadly, but especially in the subject of the Millennium Development Goals. When leaders said 10 years ago that this was a 15-year project, I had little expectation that we'd be filling rooms a decade later with people still talking about the MDGs, much less having rooms full of heads of state talking about the MDGs. So thank you for coming, and keep a close eye on what happens next week. It should be rather interesting. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. I think I'm going to give the floor to what has been called the forgotten MDG. And that is really energy. So I will give the floor to Kandeh Yumkella first, and we will come back to the issue of women very soon.
Good evening. Thank you very much for inviting me here. You'll have to forgive me. I'm suffering from jet lag right now. 8.5 hours here, and I came straight here. And then also I have a problem with my voice. But you know, I arrived here after 2 days of participating in the Africa-European Union Partnership on Energy. 2 days of meetings, almost 30, 35 ministers and commissioners on energy. But I'll talk about that a little later. I'll spend more time on energy, yeah? The Millennium Development Goals, I see a lot of people criticizing them. What they did for the past 10 years is give people in poor countries, particularly civil society, a set of simple indicators they can push their leadership to achieve. Very simple. I see it in Nigeria. I worked in Nigeria 3 years, but I see it at home, in my country. School children, university students and others can pick these up, understand them, and mobilize around them. They've also forced, literally, I used to be in government myself. I was a minister at one point, very young at that time. These MDGs forced governments and community leaders to focus on specific actions they could take to move social development. So whatever the criticism, they've been a good accounting system. Simple set of rules that people and their governments can begin to work against, and they can be measured. Their performance can be measured. And I tell you everywhere, these reports now are put together not by the UN. They're put together by the people in the country. We help, but they put it together themselves. And you can see them discussing. That's the good news. Bob also mentioned another good news. Thanks to India and China, the numbers look good. A lot of progress was made. When you begin to disaggregate, and I'll focus more on Africa, then you see that we have a whole lot to do. Some African countries did well. Our colleagues in UNDP report, for example, that simple interventions helped countries like Ethiopia. You know, the strategies that have worked include the abolition of primary school fees, leading to a surge in enrollment in Ethiopia, the construction of health clinics in Afghanistan, which helped reduce under 5 child mortality, and Ghana's nationwide fertilizer subsidy also helped to increase food production. You see, these are simple interventions that were taken up in different countries, but the MDGs enabled them to do that. I want to talk more about the world that changed in 10 years. The MDGs were good. And yes, the next week, we sit and assess what worked and what did not work. What more needs to be done in 5 years. My advocacy for the past 5 years, and it will continue, I have always said we need to look beyond the MDGs. We need to look beyond 2015. And in fact, since 2008, the impetus is even stronger now, that we look beyond 2015. The MDGs left some things out. Growth, for example. When we adopted MDGs in 2000, we wanted to talk about the social sector. Good. It's worked, it's going on. We need to complement that with growth. We need also to look at the countries that have done well, India and China, moving almost 500 million people out of poverty in 2 decades. How did they do it? No other nation on earth has been able to achieve that. How did they do it? And for me, that's why I hope next week, for the leaders, there will be some pragmatic discussion, not dogma and ideology. Because particularly for Africans, we need to be in a hurry. We need to be in a hurry in Africa. At the time that we were addressing the MDGs and hoping that by 2015 we would have achieved them, the world changed. We had a food and financial crisis. And we have what? The biggest elephant in the room, climate change. Climate change. And some of you know the indicators. If climate change, business as usual continues, agricultural production, for example, in Africa will drop by 50%. Our yields will just drop. If we do not accelerate wealth creation, diversification, and trade in higher value products, Africa remains poor. We're stuck on commodities. We're stuck on commodities. This is why, for me, I shifted to talk more about the missing MDG, energy. When we adopted the MDGs in 2000, we didn't include much discussions or indicators even for jobs. We did not include enough indicators on growth. The reality is, for China, India, and those that are doing well, you need to grow fast, 7, 8, 10%. That requires technology transfer, structural change in the economy, from just reliance on commodities to moving into higher value products or doing what some of the Asians did, starting with labor-intensive manufacturers. Agriculture alone will not do it. Even in China, the impact of rapid industrialization pulled agricultural productivity up. There was a direct connection and correlation. These are issues we did not cover. And so if we're looking at the success cases, the world must be ready to talk about structural change, more trade. We've still not finished the Doha round. But we promised poor countries that they can trade their way out of poverty. We still have agricultural subsidies that are suppressing growth in developing countries. Aid is not going to do it. In fact, we see the declines. I see my colleague Ellen Clark mentions here that although there is significant increase in aid, we in fact expect shortfalls of $17.7 billion since 2005. Times are hard. It's difficult to raise money. So we cannot rely on aid. And in fact, in Africa, as Dambisa Moyo is saying now, young generation African, we cannot keep relying on aid. And if we should not rely on aid, our economies must change. Energy is going to be crucial. It is the missing MDG, and I'll just show you a few slides here that I brought just to hammer this, and that's what I've been doing for the UN. Focusing in the last 3-5 years to say we must look at aid. This is a Financial Times article that was there in 2008 on Uganda, one of our success cases that has done very well on a number of the MDGs and HIV/AIDS. When this article was written in 2008 in Financial Times, the population growth rate in Uganda was 3.3%. The analysts estimate that in 27 years or 30 years, the population of Uganda will double. For the children to be as poor, not as rich, as poor as their parents, that economy should double. It should double in 30 years. To achieve that, MDGs are not enough. You've got to do more. Investments in infrastructure, trade opportunities, technology transfer, and structural change, movement into higher value products. Fortunately for Uganda, they discovered oil. And the estimates are, yes, their GDP is going to grow fast now because they found a new natural capital. And I'll spend a little bit of time. Next slide. Energy. Women spend many hours collecting firewood. They bring it home, probably after working on the farm. This is from Asia, but the same story applies in Africa. And for some of the poor countries, a woman like that may even have a child behind her back, carrying the child, carrying wood after working on the farm, spending a lot of time collecting fuel wood. In addition, also probably has to go back and fetch water to cook. We have estimates from WHO and from Berkeley, University of Berkeley and others, that the use of biomass causes indoor air pollution, and we estimate that every year about 1.5 to 1.6 million people die from indoor air pollution, most of them women and children. So the time spent collecting fuel wood and the social impact, negative social impact of deaths that occur. Energy access is crucial if we're going to accelerate movement on the MDGs. This is why of the many side events you hear, some of them are intended. Next week, the 80-something side events, I have 2 of them myself. Some of them are meant to say to the heads of states and the governments, hey, there are other things you left out. Without them, nothing happens. You cannot achieve the MDGs. Energy is one of them. Just to give you the gender aspect of the next slide. The Secretary General set up a group last year, which I chair, and we brought in some chief executives of various companies, some involved in energy systems like Statoil, Vattenfall. These are big power generating companies, but also Suntech, the largest solar PV producer in the world. The UN Foundation, academics and others to look at the energy connection to the global challenges around the world. We set up these 2 goals, which we'll be launching a campaign on. Achievement of universal energy access to modern energy services by 2030. The second one, reducing global energy intensity by 40% by 2030. Why should we do this? I give you some numbers to show you why this is significant, yeah? We have said that the biggest challenge mankind faces today is climate change. Well, 80% of the greenhouse gases, 80% of CO2 comes from energy-related services, power generation, transport, heating buildings, and so on. And a significant, probably 64% of other greenhouse gases also from energy systems. If you have to fix climate change, you must have an energy revolution. You living in America, you hear Obama talking about it every day, so I don't need to hammer that point for you. If you want to fix climate change, you must deal with energy. Yeah? So that's why we put an efficiency goal. But in poor countries, we also cut the trees to get firewood. And in the world today, almost 3 billion people do not have access to reliable energy supply. 1.6 billion of those have no access to electricity. I know this. You know, coming here today reminded me when I landed here in the United States in 1983. Fresh from Africa, 23 years old, ambitious, and I landed, I had an Asian student who picked me up at the airport and took the train. We came to 42nd Street. I was there with my white dashiki, you know, real African dress, and I was just amazed at the buildings. But at one point I stood there and thought of my university where I had just graduated from. We used to study many times with candlelight. We used to walk 2-3 kilometers down the road to wash in the river, come back, because there's not enough energy to pump the water to the dormitories. We used to watch if there's no power supply or food being cooked outside in open air pots. So for me at that time, I was determined then to put energy on the agenda. Unfortunately, joining the UN, I was given the opportunity. Energy access is going to be crucial if the MDGs are going to be achieved. There's no economy that can grow without a reliable and affordable supply of energy. I've given you some of the numbers. Whether you want to deal with climate change or you want to remove poverty, we must deal with energy access. Ellen Clark from UNDP, in her new 8-point agenda, maybe her colleague will be talking about that, she believes it. And so I didn't have to convince her. She's from Asia, she told me. She said, Mr. Yumkella, you don't have to convince me about trade or energy or growth. I'm from Asia. That's how we fought poverty. My conclusion is the following. We must think beyond MDGs, beyond 2015. The dynamics have changed. The demographic pressures are very serious. Africa has the worst indicators on various MDGs, but Africa is rich. Africa needs to change how it does business. The next few slides, because Elisabeth asked me to talk a little bit about governance here. Energy governance, in your courses, you better begin to talk about that. Foreign policy is connected to oil and gas and access to energy. There is a mad rush for energy resources. Next slide. This is West Africa. The US Navy is training West African Navy now to take care of the sea channels in the Gulf of Guinea. You know why? When I was here, 83, Reagan time, we had a map of Africa. The Africa according to Ronald Reagan. Africa was Egypt and the rest. That's not the case today. George Bush realized he wanted to diversify fuel, oil and gas sources for the United States. And for many other reasons, security and so on, he established the US Command, based in Germany, just for Africa. They're training people now to keep those lanes open for many reasons, but one of them is energy resources. Some estimate that maybe 17 to 20% of US oil and gas may come from there, from Angola all the way. But the important thing is a number of our poor countries are identifying oil and gas resources now. Ghana, Sierra Leone. We're finding oil and gas and energy resources in some of the poorest countries in the world. Chad, Mauritania, Niger, Sierra Leone, possibly Liberia. Question, is energy security only for rich countries? Will these countries be like the Niger Delta? 40 years of flaring gas. My last slide will show you that. A picture from foreign policy, that one. That's what we should avoid. This is the Niger Delta from Foreign Policy magazine, March this year. Gas flaring for 40 years. That's gas that should have been piped into homes. That's gas that should have been used for power generation. 150 million people in Nigeria, less than 3,000 megawatts of power supply. And that economy cannot grow. There will be chaos. Question, should these people supply oil and gas only for you and me to be comfortable with our SUVs and Mercedes, or do they have a right to have power? Look at that. The kids are playing soccer around that gas flaring, and their homes do not have light. You see the darkness at the back? Go and Google this article. That's the kind of injustice you don't need in this world. So in the future, we know already, that's why the Secretary General is paying attention to energy security for all, universal access. We believe that if we don't have open dialogue on energy systems and also be committed to universal energy access, there will be additional global problems, the kinds we've not seen now. I know already in Europe, there are a lot of discussions about different pipelines, so it's redefining political relationships in Europe. My message here is to achieve the MDGs, you need to power those economies. We must look at wealth creation. No nation has reduced poverty and become prosperous without structural change, without moving into higher value products and manufacturing. In the MDG debate in 2000, we didn't want to talk about that. Africa needs it. Thank you.
Well, Kandeh was telling me that he was falling asleep just when we started the panel. Well, you certainly woke us up, that's for sure. I don't think I have a choice but giving the floor to UNDP at this point. They have been mentioned so much. We want to hear what UNDP is thinking about the goals and what they are doing. And of course, it will lead to the women, because I think they have really, Helen Clark and Rebeca have really emphasized the role of women in development and are convinced that we cannot reach the MDG without women. So here we are. Rebeca.
Thank you so much. Thank you, and I'm sorry I was late. I'm sorry, Bob. but we were talking with Jomo. What was your introduction about? So thank you so much. Let me try to get some of the main messages that we would like to leave with you today. I think that the first message we want to leave with you is that the MDGs are achievable and that a lot has been done. And so this is not the moment to weaken the effort. And I think that we have to really make it happen for the people for which the promise was done. And there was like a special, like a contract that was signed with the MDGs, you know. In a way, the international community said, we will put the resources if the countries put the will, the programs, the strategies, the good governance for the resources be used for the poor. And many of them did it. They comply with that part of the contract. So the first thing that we have to tell the international community is that we cannot abandon them now that they have done part of the deal. And that the effort has to continue from the side of the countries and has to continue on the side of the international community. So this is like the first thing I want to leave. The second is that we have to recognize that the crisis did hit the poorest that were not responsible for the crisis in a major way. So some of the setbacks come from the crisis. If my memory is okay, I think that according to the World Bank, 62 million people would have been on poverty today if it wasn't for the crisis, you know. So the same with the crisis in food, the same with the crisis in oil, and the same with the crisis in climate change, in the environment. And what happens in the poor countries when the volatility of the economy and with the volatility of environment or climate-related events is that the short-term poverty doesn't go away. You know, you really in those crises have the problem of converting like short-term temporary poverty into structural poverty, precisely because families have to take decisions during the crisis that affect the whole life of the kids for the rest of their lives. If they go out of school, if they are undernourished, that will be sick. There will be problems related to that will live with them forever. So the problem with the volatility of climate change or climate-related events or economic crisis is precisely that maybe the rich will get out of the crisis and forget about it, but the poor will live the consequences of the crisis forever. So the problem of the volatility of growth of economic and environment-related events is very severe for the world, and so there has to be an understanding of how to preclude those events for them to be able to have a more stable growth and development. The third point that I want to leave with you is the problem of inequality. And something that we have called the tyranny of averages, and how to go beyond the tyranny of average. So we can achieve the MDGs on average, but it may well be that the most vulnerable and the poorest of the poor won't feel any improvement in their lives. Because on average, we'll be okay with the MDGs. But if we look and disaggregate what is happening, really, there's a lot of inequalities between countries and within countries and regions. So my third message is we have to disaggregate the MDGs. And we have to see very clearly what is happening to the rural populations where we cannot get to them, what is happening with ethnic groups that are excluded, what is happening with women in all the MDGs, what is happening to the black populations where they are a minority, etc. So the disaggregation of the MDGs is a key point for the future. And my fourth point, and thank you so much for referring for the 8 points agenda, is that we have done this very important study where we took 50 countries and really looked in depth what has happened to the MDGs. And the whole purpose of this exercise is to really see what works, what doesn't work, and what are the main bottlenecks and obstacles that we need to look at to accelerate progress towards 2015 for achieving the MDGs. And the things that came from that study is an 8-point agenda that was referred by my colleague. And I will divide the conclusions into two groups to be very quick with you. The first group is the things that we know, that we all know, because we know a lot about development and what works and what doesn't, that the study emphasizes, because if we forget about it, the MDGs won't be achieved. And the second group is those that we have to reflect more about them because they have not been included, or we know less about how to go about those obstacles, or they were a little bit absent from the agenda. In the first group, we have like 4 conclusions. The first one is that we need to support country-led development to accelerate and sustain progress. Development has to be led from within, from the countries, from the leadership, from the government, in partnership with the private sector, with civil society, but it cannot be imposed from outside. So the first thing to emphasize is the importance of country-led development. The second one that we all know also is that the investment, we need to target investments in health, in education, in clean water, and in sanitation. And we know that, so let me not expand too much on it. The third one is that we need to invest in women and girls. And that's what was also said in the introduction. And that's important for all the MDGs, not only for MDG 3, that is on women and girls, but for all the MDGs, that's important. I will refer to that in the second group again, from a different angle. So those 3 things we know. We know what works. So why are still the MDGs, for example, related to women lagging behind? If we know what works, we know that it's important for all of them. So we need to look deeper into really the obstacles that are an impediment for achieving the MDGs and doing what should be done in these 3. Let me go to the second group. That is when I want to expand more. And I think that it was referred to that before too. The first one is how do we foster inclusive economic growth? And let me really emphasize inclusive, because we know how to foster growth with exclusion. The problem is how to foster growth with inclusion. You know, in many of the countries of Africa, growth has happened, and very little has happened in terms of fighting poverty. So the real challenge is to be able to foster inclusive growth. And one of the main problems with inclusive growth is precisely the neglect of the agricultural sector. And so to recover the importance of agriculture and small farming for inclusive growth, especially in Africa that you were talking about so eloquently, is a key point. And the second point is that it's not only important to invest in women and girls. The important thing is to empower women. And it's different, and let me leave this with you too, it's different just to invest in women and girls than to empower them. To close the gaps in education and in health is a key point. But to empower women economically and politically is really the way to make it sustainable. And that's a central point of inclusive economic growth. So empowerment, political and economic empowerment of women is at the center of the agenda. And I hope that my colleague will talk much more about that. We can create the clinics, but women may not go to the clinics if they are not empowered in certain cultures. We can create the opportunities, but women need to be able to take the decisions by themselves to be able to take advantage of the opportunities. And we can create the conditions for growth, but if women don't have a voice, so growth won't happen in the same way and with the same rate that we need it to happen. So empowerment of women and the agricultural sector are key on this, on this agenda. The fifth point that I want to make is the one that has already been made, that is the missing MDG, that is energy. And it's absolutely true that we have to distinguish between goals and means. If we will think that everything has to be an MDG, so we will end up with an agenda of 1,000 goals. But the truth is that we have to look also at the means, and energy is a key mean to achieve all the MDGs. Let me just say here that it's important to think not only on grid energy, but off-grid energy. That is precisely a key point for agriculture and for rural development and for local development. So I know you did that, you made that point so eloquently that I won't continue on that. The seventh point of the agenda is the resource mobilization. And here, as I said before, there is an important agenda in terms of internal resource mobilization. So the fiscal structures of the countries, the tax, have to be looked at to be able to mobilize the internal resources to achieve the MDGs. And the second part is the international assistance, official development assistance, so they can match the funds to be able to foster the development in the poorest countries that don't have enough resources alone to be able to achieve the progress that is needed. So this is the 8-point agenda, and we know that those 8 points have been known, as I said, for a long time. It's not new, most of them. The only thing that I really want to stress is that we cannot let it go now. We have to accelerate progress and to strengthen the effort for all these 8 points that we are in our hands to make happen, for the MDGs to be achievable, to be brought to next week's gathering, and for all the leaders of the world to re-energize the commitment to achieve the MDGs. So in UNDP, we have produced this international assessment and the 8-point agenda. We have created what we call an MDG acceleration framework that is a methodology precisely to make the diagnostics, what is happening and what are the bottlenecks for the MDGs, for each of the MDGs to be achieved. We have implemented a pilot stage in 10 countries to understand if this can be used as a general tool. The results are really impressive in the sense that it can be used for the diagnostic, to create the roadmap, to understand what are the bottlenecks that are not only in the minds of those that are in a narrow, maybe, way looking at the MDG. For example, if you look at maternal mortality only from a health perspective, you may be losing many of the issues that are really on the obstacles, that are really on the way for achieving the decrease in maternal mortality that we are looking for. The same happens in education. The same happens with the other MDGs. So the really the idea is to have this framework, to look at it from the bottlenecks that are an impediment for accelerating progress, and in an interagency way, be able with the government to create the conditions, the roadmap, the approaches, the interventions, and the targeted interventions that will allow us to get to 2015 with the greater rate of success. So the poor of the world and have looked at the MDGs not like us, not like targets or aspirations. They have looked at it in a very concrete way, that is their daily lives, the improvement of their daily lives. We look at them maybe as indicators. They look at them as their way for survival and to be able to provide a better life for their families and their children. I hope the international community next week with the Secretary General will really hear them and will get up to the task and re-energize the promise that we did to millions, all the millions of poor of the world in 2000. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Rebeca. I would like to ask Jomo to tell us if we can really reduce poverty by half in 5 years, and what do we need to do. So, Jomo, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Elisabeth, for this kind invitation, and the presence of all these wonderful people here tonight is testimony to the distinction of my colleagues here, all of whom have been leaders in very different ways and bring a great deal to the discussion. But also, Elisabeth, to your leadership in revitalizing United Nations studies at SIPA. Let me try to share with you some thoughts on progress as far as MDGs are concerned. And I'll run through a number of slides because we have, I'd like to keep as much time open for discussion after, and we still have Nafis to listen to as well. I think the first thing to recognize, as Rebeca has correctly emphasized, is that the MDGs are achievable. But it's also very important to recognize that there are a number of concerns about whether or not the MDGs should be the central mobilizing theme around which we think about development. And I'll come back to this question later. Next, please. Now, if we look at the MDGs, as Bob and Kandeh have emphasized, much of the progress on the first goal of the MDGs, which is to halve poverty and hunger, is largely attributable to China. And I'm not even sure we're measuring the correct things. Because when you think about what has happened in China, undoubtedly money incomes have significantly increased. But you also know that public provisioning, for example, health, and to a lesser extent education, has suffered. So how do we measure this? If we simply use a money metric measure, we get certain kinds of results. And this really raises the question of how do we understand poverty, how do we measure poverty, and the whole range of issues related to that. As a number of speakers have emphasized, in Africa there has actually been a significant increase in the number of poor people. Next, please. Now, we have a very curious situation where, according to the Rome agencies, which work on hunger issues, most significantly FAO, but also the World Food Programme as well as IFAD, they have been reporting, together with the US Department of Agriculture, that hunger in the world has actually increased over the last 2 decades. Yet we are told, according to the World Bank's measure through what is called the International Comparison Programme, that poverty in the world has come down from over half the world's population to slightly over a quarter of the world's population over the over the period from about 1990 to the middle of the past decade. Now, this, of course, is undoubtedly a significant achievement. But if the poverty line is defined as what it takes to avoid being hungry, we obviously have a problem. because one measure suggests that more people are hungry, and the other measure suggests that fewer people are poor. So something is wrong. And this becomes a very important challenge of measurement. And how do we understand poverty, and how do we measure poverty? And this is why, for example, a few years ago, you may remember, books were written about the bottom billion and such like. And then suddenly, when the new figures came out 2 years ago, we suddenly had a figure jump from 1 billion to 1.4 billion. And nobody could, it doesn't sell books, to write about a bottom 1.4 billion. And so, anyway, obviously there is a measurement problem. Next, please. Now, one of the major thrusts of the review of the MDGs is really to begin to think about what we may have missed at the first take. Okay? And one of the very important additions to the discussion of the MDGs was the whole question of employment. And so in 2005, at the major review conference, and Bob had just come on board together, and I had just come on board as well, one of the major new additions, one of the major additional targets put on was the whole question of employment. And today we see this, we see how significant this is. This is not simply something which is significant for developing countries, where unemployment is not really an option, but we should think about vulnerable employment, informal employment, etc., etc. But we see this in the developed countries, where unemployment has gone up to double digits in many countries of the world. Even in this country, for example, where unemployment is just below 10%, we know that many people have dropped out of looking for jobs. And the latest figures from the US Census Bureau, which came out today, suggest that significantly more people are poor in the United States as well. Next, please. Now, as far as MDG 2 is concerned, progress on education, this is one of the areas where it appears that we have had significant progress. Many questions have been raised, however, whether we are stuffing more children into schools. The same amount of resources in terms of teaching resources and so on and so forth, but certainly there are far more children going into schools, and very significantly the gender gap between girls and boys has been reduced somewhat. Not enough, but there has been significant progress. Next, please. As far as gender equality on other fronts is concerned, we find that there's still a great deal which needs to be done. I don't want to go into detail because we have heard and we will hear from Nafis as well, but Bob and Rebeca have already alluded to this, and Kandeh as well. Next, please. Now, 4, 5, and 6 deal with health. And this is where, in a sense, the United Nations has kept the health issue alive. There are many people who would like to talk about development in the world without talking about health issues. And it is I think one of the very important successes of the MDGs has actually to keep the health issues very much alive. Now, there are many challenges, many of which have been addressed, some of which have been addressed reasonably successfully. Work on HIV/AIDS, for example, there has been significant progress. As far as tuberculosis, there has been more modest progress. Malaria, the reporting is mixed, but there appears to have been significant progress, at least in some parts of the world. But there are a range of neglected tropical diseases which continue to be very much neglected. Not all of them. Former President Carter, for example, has done a great deal as far as guinea worm is concerned, but as far as Chagas disease from West Africa, Kandeh knows this very well, a number of other diseases in the equatorial zone, we find that there has been very little progress which has been achieved. There has been significant progress in reducing under 5 mortality and so on and so forth, but still a great deal more needs to be done. Next, please. Now, as far as the health MDGs is concerned, Bob made a very important observation that there has been the area where there has been least progress has been in the area of maternal mortality. And this, of course, raises a whole range of issues. The whole question of gender and how we treat women, the whole question of public health, because can you reduce maternal mortality in isolation from public health advances more generally, and a range of other issues. Now, another problem which might not seem to be such a big problem is how do we measure this? And many of us, many people do not know that in sub-Saharan Africa, 41% of sub-Saharan African countries have not had a census in 3.5 decades. So this whole problem which Bob mentioned earlier, the problem of how do we measure the reductions in maternal mortality, part of the problem is that the highest incidence of maternal mortality is occurring in countries where we don't even know how many women there are, how many women have been dying, and so on and so forth. Nafis, Sadik, when she was leading UNFPA, was very aware of this issue, but unfortunately, there has been very little progress. Because many people do not think, for example, that something as boring as statistics matters. Now, one of the Secretary General's major initiatives, in fact, the major initiative this year, has precisely been on maternal and child health. And this has been taken up by the G8, among others, but there is really much more work which needs to be done in this area. Next, please. Now, environmental sustainability. I think this is one of the areas where criticisms can correctly be made of the MDGs. The MDGs did not adequately appreciate the challenges ahead. We have also had set targets which have not been met. This year, for example, the loss of biodiversity is supposed to be stopped. That target is unlikely to be met. Besides maternal mortality, the other area where there has been least progress has been sanitation. And as former President Mikhail Gorbachev pointed out in an editorial a few months ago, the number of people who die from gastrointestinal diseases related to poor sanitation exceeds the number of people who have died from conflict-related violence in the post-war period. Okay? Not something which grabs many headlines, but nonetheless very compelling. We also have a very, very important success story, and that is the reduction of the emission of CFCs, which affects the ozone layer and so on. And this, of course, raises a number of issues. Now, what does this suggest? It suggests that inclusive multilateralism can work, that even for a very difficult issue such as the ozone layer, it worked. And of course, the challenges as far as climate change are concerned are even more significant and much greater. But nonetheless, the success story of the Montreal Protocol suggests to us that it is very important to continue to work within inclusive multilateral frameworks to be able to make significant progress on matters which really count in the world today. Next, please. Now, there are a whole range of other questions as far as environment is concerned. I'll just raise one issue, and that is the MDGs, when first formulated, grossly underestimated the number of slum dwellers in the world. It aimed to improve the conditions of 100 million slum dwellers. Now, any of you who have worked on urban planning issues and urban problems know that this is a gross underestimate of the scale of the problem. So, but it is very important to recognize that we have made mistakes so that we can improve our work. And this is why I think it is very important to engage critically and be open-minded about the issues which we face and the challenges which we face. Next, please. The other area, MDG 8, is the subject of is really about international cooperation. And this is what the United Nations is largely about. How do we mobilize the international community to work around matters of common concern, in this case poverty and the whole range of other MDGs. And this is where there are a range of issues. Today, the Secretary General launched the MDG Gap Report. This report has come out, this is the third year of the publication of the report. It's due to collaboration between the Secretariat and the UNDP. And this report was launched this morning by the Secretary General, and already there have been more than 300 news items all over the world about this report. It basically identifies shortfalls in a whole range of areas. We don't have time to go through them. The whole question of aid, the whole question of aid effectiveness, aid fragmentation, a whole range of other issues. Next, please. The question of the role of trade, the importance of food security, aid for trade issues, the questions of trade access. Next, please. And the importance of technology. Now, Kandeh Yumkella is co-chair of the initiative on technology in relation to the Bali Action Plan as far as climate change is concerned. There are a whole range of issues there, which are quite complex, but nonetheless, it's precisely in collaboration between universities such as SIPA and the United Nations and other inclusive multilateral organizations that we will be able to make progress. Next, please. Now, these are some, I'm listing some of the criticisms which you have already heard, I'm sure, or may hear about the MDGs and so on and so forth. But I think, as Bob reminded us at the outset, it has precisely been because of the success in the MDGs in terms of focusing attention that I think that the MDGs, in retrospect, after a decade, we can say that has probably been the greatest success. If we think of the MDGs as the visible tip of the iceberg, a very complex iceberg of development, and recognize that there are a whole range of issues which are not necessarily directly addressed through the MDGs, which also need to be addressed, but this particular focus on human welfare, which is the visible tip of the MDGs, I do think you will agree that certainly the MDGs has been able to capture the imagination of millions of people in the world, and to be able to move resources and energies in order to try to work towards what I think we will all agree are very important and noble goals. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Jomo. In good diplomatic dinners, the most important ambassador speaks last. So, Nafis, you have the floor. What do we do about maternal mortality?
Thank you very much for inviting me here today. I think the fact that this is such a full house is actually a tribute to you, Elisabeth, because I've spoken here on several occasions before, and there have been, quite a lot of students, but never this kind of interest in the UN subject. You introduced me as a formidable woman, and that reminded me a little bit of the International Conference on Population and Development, where some of you will remember that we had many issues with the Holy See on sexual and reproductive health and family planning, which I'm sure we all know about. And at the end of the conference, the head of the Holy See delegation said to me that I have told the Holy Father that never do I want to lead a Holy See delegation at which Dr. Sadik is in any way interested, because she is one of the most formidable women I have ever met. And I said, I suppose that coming from you is a compliment. He said he was not sure whether it was meant to be a compliment. Anyway, I think your title, the MDGs, can we keep the promise? Obviously, the answer is yes, if we want to. I mean, that's so obvious. But if we ask the question, will we keep the promise? Really, my answer would be probably not, regardless of all the wonderful words we say and the high expectations that we have. And I really must say that also there's a great deal of interest in the MDGs. The MDG and the goals have really captured the imagination of all the countries of the world. I remember 5 years ago going to so many conferences, especially in East Asia, China, Malaysia, Indonesia, who were hysterical about the fact that they might not achieve, and China in particular, some of the MDG goals. But some of that urgency has seemed to decrease in the recent years, and we need to find a way to keep that interest going. And I think a lot of suggestions have been made by everybody here, but I'm not quite sure whether we can capture that. There have also been suggestions that we should increase the number of goals in sense to 10, and I hear this, in various meetings that I've been attending, that energy should have been an MDG goal. And of course, I always push sexual and reproductive health and rights for women, because really, if you look at gender equality, if you look at all the social goals, especially all the health goals, they're not going to be achieved unless women are empowered. And why are women not empowered still with all the talk that we have and all the interest and all the support? We talk about education as the means. But in many of our countries, girls' education is not seen as important. Their economic security, and that's what they are brainwashed into thinking, comes from being married and from having a husband. And therefore, their subservience to a male model is inbuilt in our societies. And this you see very much in South Asia, where you see this very great preference for men, for boys. But also in Africa, and to some extent also in Latin America. So I think that while the global conferences of the 1990s, and I was still in the United Nations in 2000, when we were discussing the Millennium Development Goals, and if all of you are students and if you do your research, you'll see that all of the goals that are in the Millennium Development Goal were first, in fact, quantified in the International Conference on Population and Development, and then they were repeated again in Beijing in the Social Summit and human rights and elsewhere, etc. But the key goal of the Cairo conference was sexual and reproductive health and rights for women and girls. And that goal was not accepted in 2000. I was telling Bob, I'm going to refer to him a little bit. And, I fought hard for it. But there was a lot of political reasons. There was reluctance on the part of governments who had come to the Cairo and the Beijing conference and had been sort of forced into accepting this as a goal. But when it came to actual implementation, you heard all kinds of excuses from governments. Really, girls and women cannot have this right to make their own decisions about fertility matters, about if they should marry, when they should marry, because, these things are so important, and we must oversee it. We meaning, translate that into men. So therefore, it's not surprising to me that MDG 4, reducing maternal mortality, has not really reduced, not made. And we've been saying the same figures. In Cairo, the first studies on maternal mortality were done by UNICEF, WHO, and UNFPA, with funding from UNFPA. You can consider that. That was in preparation for the ICPD. And that figure came to over 500,000. We use that figure forever and ever. In every women's conference, every gender conference, this figure is. Recently, a few months ago, the Lancet did a study and reported that maternal mortality had declined a little bit, not the goal. It's now, all about 300,000, not 500,000, and there's a recent report from the UN as well saying that. But, this is the biggest differential between developed and developing countries, is the level of maternal mortality. And it's something that can be totally eliminated, almost, because, 99% of the deaths can be prevented. And if women are to be out of poverty, but if their role is seen as in service of, how are they empowered and how are they going to get out of poverty? Because that is not in their hands. It's always in the hands of someone else. And so I think that if we want to really achieve our goals of poverty reduction, sharing, inclusiveness, all the right words, that every person, everyone should be, have the opportunities, the possibility of making choices, should have their rights protected, and access to the means of economic empowerment, which is also a key, and so on. I mean, I agree with everybody, but I think they haven't really thought through how every single person in each country is actually going to be enabled to do that, especially young girls whose rights are preempted by their parents. Society doesn't protect them. It's sort of the value in the cultural system, values that prevail in the society that dictate what will happen to girls. That we are here, and many of the women, I talk about South Asia and Africa and developing countries, is because our parents did that for us. So no girl should have to have, good parents to get her right. A right is a right that has to be protected and given. And I think that is something that the Millennium Development Goals discussion have to understand and really look at. I'm not sure that the discussions will be open to these kinds of suggestions, even though, as Bob was saying, there are a lot of very exciting things happening. There are strategies being discussed. And, countries have, in fact, done a lot of work. But on this issue of really enabling girls and women to have the opportunity to make their own choices, there is not that much progress. There is now included in Target 5B, achieved by 2015, universal access to reproductive health, but still no mention of rights. And I think that is a key word, right, that has to be protected. Remember, there are still over 200 million unintended or unwanted pregnancies. And if you reduce those or eliminated those, maternal mortality would reduce by 20 to 30%, just like that, by doing what actually women want and are not enabled to do. Also remember, as I said earlier, that in the large part of the developing countries, the role of girls is predetermined and so I'm not sure that is going to change unless we in the UN development system and others really make that observation. And this makes me come to the point of the gender entity, as it was called for a long time, but a funny word. And then now it's called UN Women, which is also a very funny word. But, it's like an odd organization. So all the rest of the organizations are UN men? No, I hope not. I expect, and I wrote a paper about it once, and I said, we have UNIFEM, which existed at that time, and there were high expectations from the UN Fund for Women, and the whole UN system, except perhaps for UNFPA and to some extent UNICEF, said that, this for women, this has been done by UNIFEM. And UNIFEM had like $75 or $100 million. And I wrote in that paper that we have a small ghetto now. Let's not get a large ghetto, unless what we really need is for every part of the system to really look at the needs for women and men in every area, to really start to think about how will it be done and what does it mean. Resources must go and flow from every. So unless this UN Women does that, I don't think that it can be successful. I think a very eminent and I'm sure very powerful woman has been named as the head of the UN Women. But what her powers are going to be, how much support she's going to get, and what authority she will have in the UN system, that will determine whether this entity can really oversee and push the rest of the UN system to do what is needed. On the hopeful side, I can see that a great deal of change in gender relations, much of it the result of unremitting work by women's organizations. Gender-based violence has come into very public prominence. Many issues that we didn't talk about publicly are now in the public domain, and then that in itself is very much progress. But I think it is really time that some of these goals need to be more pushed. And for example, we have a special rapporteur in the UN for, for gender sexual violence. When they asked my advice on names, I said, why are you looking for women? We should have some general, because these are all military people doing this. And why are you, sticking this to a woman to do? I mean, I'm not quite sure why these selections are made. And it's been decided these are women's jobs and those are men's jobs, instead of looking at what is needed and how it's needed to be done. So this entity, UN Women, I think has great potential, but only if there is committed leadership, there is the authority, and they can oversee and do the oversight of the entire UN system to make sure that gender issues are really addressed, which means equality and empowerment of women, and that the key areas in which women need empowering, starting from birth and having choices, is really addressed. And I think the Millennium Goals will we succeed? Yes, I think then we need strong committed leadership, that goes without saying. But I don't underestimate the difficulties of the task. Secondly, the new entity will need a remit that covers the entire spectrum of the United Nations operation. Will the system allow that entity to actually have that role? Third, success calls for the unremitting commitment of each part of the UN family to women's empowerment and gender equality in its own particular area of operations, which I'm not sure that they do. Creation of this new UN Women doesn't relieve other agencies of their responsibility to promote women's empowerment and gender equality. Genuine mainstreaming depends on the commitment of the whole system on this, as is the wider aim of ending extreme poverty, which either we stand together or we fall together. I remember a civil society woman in a major conference, a major roundtable, which was being hosted by CNN, and Vice President Gore was speaking, and there were a whole space of, and she shouted to somebody, I don't know, she wasn't very happy with the statement, and she said, you, if you don't help us to relieve and get out of poverty, you are going to be doomed to share it with us. We are one world, and I think we need to remember that. Thank you.
I want to thank all our speakers for their illuminating presentations and sometimes thought-provoking. I think you are dying to take the floor. So I should give the floor to students. You must have a lot of questions. We will take 3 questions at a time. And please, I will not accept any student who makes another presentation now. It has to be a short question. So I will interrupt you very rudely if you are starting to tell us about your life or whatever it is. Just give us your name and ask your question, and if possibly tell us which speaker you are asking your question to. So just go to the microphone and let's start the dialogue, so to speak. Okay, you have the floor.
Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Ketue, and I had a question for the whole panel. Thank you for all for being here. I basically had a question referring to agriculture and some of the arguments I've heard just pushing towards trade preferences that expand to the agricultural sector in terms of commodities, especially in reference to sub-Saharan Africa, and particularly to the countries that are considered to be the least developed. I've kind of heard some of the feedback on what the prospects for agriculture are in terms of the Millennium Development Goals, but I'm just wondering about some of the arguments that are pushing for more expansion in the trade sector. What are your thoughts, and what are some of the challenges or feasibility you would foresee in that sector?
Question number 2.
This is for Mr. Yumkella. Did I say that right? When you were talking about growth and the importance of higher value products, manufacturing, and various other technology transfer, various other things that you said, when you look at countries that have been effective and countries that haven't, what are the things that prevent those countries that haven't been effective? Where are the bottlenecks? What's happening that needs to stop happening? What isn't happening that needs to happen to achieve that?
Question number 3.
Thank you all for being here. It's a great privilege. My question is about an emphasis on the global green economy. It seems as though an emphasis on that as a means of achieving or a few of the MDGs and the phantom MDG energy would be achieved by focusing on the green economy. I was wondering, for example, focusing on solar stoves as a way of alleviating indoor air pollution. That would both increase people's health and would increase maternal health as well. I had the chance to interview
What is your question?
So could you just comment on what you think the promise is of a global green economy? Thank you.
Okay. Shall we take 3 questions? Do you want to start on the issue of growth?
The last one is easier. Start from the back. It's 2 a.m. Vienna time right now. Indeed, we're looking at these new green technologies as a means of enhancing particularly energy access. Some of the recommendations we've given in a report we launched for the Secretary General on April this year. We talk about the possibilities of mini-grids and off-grids solutions for energy access in rural communities using some of these new green technologies. On the 21st of this month, I think that's next Tuesday, Hillary Clinton will be launching a global initiative on cook stoves. We're looking at solar stoves and others as well, but she has made a solid pledge of funds. It will be done together with the UN Foundation and other UNDP, UNIDO, and several other UN agencies. We're hoping to leverage more resources, but there's quite a bit of effort now to spread these green technologies. Secretary Chu just had a meeting in July, what we call the first clean energy ministerial meeting. He invited the 24 countries that account for about 80% of global energy demand to look at what is available, what they can do to deploy some of these ready green technologies to developing countries to enhance energy access. Bottlenecks and barriers, there are many bottlenecks and barriers for whether it's technology transfer or achieving growth. For some countries, serious governance problems. In Africa, we've had quite a bit of challenges with stability, civil wars, but also some problems around the world on corruption. Corruption is a big hindrance to development and growth. When you have bad governance, a lot of what we've said about giving ownership to the people and so on, all of that goes by the wayside. So good governance, good leadership is important. I think one of the other serious problems, that's why, again, as we look at Millennium Development Goals, we have to look at also how we do international development cooperation. There are some instruments that we used in the early, in the 90s, but particularly the first 5 years of the Millennium Development Goals, the so-called poverty reduction strategies. We had dictated, meaning the international development community, particularly bilateral donors, what should go into the poverty reduction strategies. Well, when we did a quick analysis a few years ago of the first generation of poverty reduction strategy papers, of 40 of them were reviewed, only 8 mentioned trade, and only 3 treated trade seriously. At the time we were talking about trade your way out of poverty. So some of the instruments that we've also introduced to developing countries have not really addressed the ambition. And when you look at some of the Asian countries that have done the transition, they've taken some advice, but a lot of the solutions have been homegrown. So having good governance, having a clear vision, and not, again, short-term strategies, strategies that look 10, 20 years. Determined and sustained effort to implement those are important. I think those were the ones for me.
Yeah. Jomo, do you want to say something about trade? Or
yes, very briefly, since there are quite a number of people waiting. As far as trade is concerned, I think what right after 9/11, there was an agreement to resume trade negotiations. Remember that before that, the Seattle interministerial had resulted in chaos. There were the demonstrators on the streets, and also within the conference hall, ministers, especially from developing countries, especially from Africa, walked out. The situation changed because of international solidarity following 9/11. What we have, however, is a situation where simple conclusion of what is on offer right now is not going to be very developmental. So the promise was of a developmental round, but there is very little which is truly of a developmental content. Last year, UNIDO published the industrial development report, which was very important, because among the people who co-authored that report were people who had previously taken positions opposing that kind of position. So you find that there is now recognition that simple trade liberalization is not necessarily developmental, especially for countries which have very little productive capacities. So right now the thinking is much more on ensuring that productive capacities built up. This is not just for industry, it's also true for agriculture. The former president of Madagascar pointed out that in 1980s, Africa was a net food exporter. By this past decade, Africa is a huge net food importer. And so this situation cannot be radically changed simply by straightforward trade liberalization. We need a much more flexible international trade regime to ensure that it is enabling for development.
Yes, Nafis.
I just wanted to add something here. One is the whole notion of ownership, which is a concept that's been pushed in the UN for many, many years, and the program must be owned by the country. But of course, it happens in theory only, not in practice. And the second issue is accountability. Who's accountable? I mean, we talk a lot, and quite rightly, about corruption and poor governance, etc. in our countries, but also the lack of accountability for the donors when they press their programs, which you were alluding to, is zero. For the World Bank, for example, there is zero when you have crises in countries because they follow diligently what the World Bank or the IMF has prescribed, and it results in chaos. There is no accountability. And in Mexico, remember, we were looking at the financing for development, and one of the issues was this accountability issue, and MDG 8 was meant to be that partnership. But that is totally not happened. And we don't talk that much about 8 except in terms of resources. But there is also the issue of accountability and policy advice. And I think the whole notion should be partnership, in which both have equal say. I'm not sure that developing countries should have total ownership when they don't actually know what they want to own. They don't really have strategies and policies. But also the donor countries really reflect their own needs often in the policies they recommend. And there is no independent adjudicator for this issue. I mean, it's really a big issue, and the UN used to be in the economic area, but it's no longer that, and doesn't have that role. So there is no independent person that can mediate on these issues.
I just wanted to tell you that my students here will have heard me saying that the UN is not a world government.
No, it's not.
And don't forget this, and don't confuse global governance with global government. The UN is not a global government. So how do you make anybody accountable when your masters are 192 member states and they dictate the things? Don't forget this. This issue of accountability also comes with the Security Council. The Security Council is accountable to no one. So if we miss the goals, who is accountable? Is there any kind of accountability here? And this is a very important point. I just wanted to mention it because nobody can educate on this. This is it. Okay.
Yeah, I wanted to take also the question on agriculture, because the trade part, I think that Jomo has done it beautifully. But let me say that we have to remember that for 2 decades, agriculture was not important in terms of the agenda and the support from the international system. And the problem of agriculture is the problem of the small farmers. It's not the big agriculture we are talking about. It's the problem of the small farmers. And there are 4 things that were really weakened during a long period of time. One is the importance of the public goods and the production of the public goods for the rural development. The second one is that subsidies became a bad word. And we know now that without subsidies for fertilizer and seeds, small farmers cannot make it. And so we are revisiting again many of the things that we knew before, but that were forgotten for 2 decades. And in the agenda, I think that is very important to remember this, because with the food prices this was again discussed a lot. And suddenly the food crisis went away, and so again the agriculture and small farmers agenda can be forgotten by the international world. So I just want you to keep us accountable for not forgetting the agriculture, small farmers agenda that is so crucial for development in the poorest countries and to fight poverty.
3 more questions.
Good evening. My question is related to the involvement of the private sector. So we know that there are companies out there which earn more than the GDP of certain countries. I used to work with a global logistics company whose sustainability strategy was centered around the UN MDGs, and they had fantastic programs in climate protection, disaster response, etc. So we know that the resources are there, the willingness is there. What can we do to really harness the potential of these companies, and how can we keep them accountable?
My name's Peter Burgess. I'm an old student. I'm still learning stuff, not affiliated with Columbia, though. I'd like to make the quick point that everything that's been said tonight has been absolutely excellent, but the UN is, by global standards today, a tiny organization. Yeah, the policies that are being put out by the UN are really pretty damn good. But the policies that are being put out by the other economic powers on this planet are unbelievably bad. And I would like to see what you have to say about a complete rethink about how Wall Street, if you will, it's all about corporate profit, all about stock market prices, all about growth. It is never about things that matter really to our future quality of life. And I was so pleased when Jomo talked about rethinking how you measure value. Because until we start doing that, I think we're heading down a terribly difficult track. Thank you for organizing this. It's been a real pleasure.
Third question. If it's a question.
Hi, my name is Jason Smith. I have a question for Dr. Yumkella. Just kind of curious in terms of opinion on the so-called resource curse. Would you see, if it even exists, but would you see its internal governance or this sort of international structure you were discussing? Where is it happening, and how do you kind of transfer resource wealth into development in any given country? So, thank you.
Kandeh, just to wake you up.
Yeah,
Was that 3?
I did an interview with the Kennedy School, which was just published, taking Sierra Leone. and the resource cost. The situation now on that, particularly for Africa, Africans need to take very seriously. Because as I mentioned just in the case of energy, but it's happening for all kinds of minerals. Coltan, for our wonderful mobile phones. I give you the microcosm of the Mano River Union, our neighborhood. Liberia has one of the largest deposits of iron ore. Sierra Leone, we just discovered our own now amongst the top 10 in the last 6-7 months. Guinea is sitting on 30 to 40% of the world's bauxite. 3 of the poorest countries, amongst the 5 poorest, have 3 of the most precious minerals in the world, in addition to many other things. And everybody's coming in. So in other parts of Africa. But the issue here is the European Union has been able now to publish the Extractive Industries Transparency Act. We hope that all nations will take this at least as one of the beginning foundations as if you will, an international standard for when you are transacting these kinds of mineral deals with governments. When these deals are made for minerals, you don't have the UN in the room. We just come in when there's a crisis. 20 years later, when the poverty is deep and there's civil war, we're called in to fix it. But these are deals between big conglomerates and small countries that do not have capacity to negotiate. Sometimes, in a good number of cases, some of these are from countries that are pushing for human rights. For me today, for Africa, if I take my country, we have no business being poor in 10 years. Bauxite, now we discovered oil, one of the rich marine resources, titanium and so on. Airbus 380 requires titanium. But the deals that are being structured now, there's not enough transparency. So part of the problem, the governments themselves. In the 21st century, we can't blame others because the best practices are known. We've seen what Norwegians have done with their oil resources. So there's what we call the Norwegian model, how you avoid the Dutch disease so that the new found wealth does not distort your price signals and incentives within your economy. We've seen partly, although it has some crisis now, but the Dubai model as well. Whatever you say, that small country, the group of Emirates, use their petroleum resources to diversify their economy. And that's the challenge for Africa. To look around and really make deals that are beneficial to their people. And part of it starts with informing the people. That's why this transparency initiative by the EU is important. Declaring publicly what is the negotiations, what is going on, and taking it to Parliament, but informing the people. Second, declaring the revenues. The people should know how much is sold. There is a country where a friend of mine was called back to set up the Petroleum Accounting Unit. It's not necessarily an African country. But this friend of mine told me that the head of state, when he was introduced, said, now you will let me know how much we really ship out of my country. So it's similar to corruption. We say there is a giver, there is a taker. Even with the corruption money, the money that leaves Africa, we're the biggest exporter of capital. It goes somewhere. The banks see the money coming in. So if we're talking international standards and so on, I think that even those coming to do the deal, so we need good corporate social responsibility, we need clear common standards when we go into poor countries to source their natural resources. But at the end of the day, the onus is on those countries that own these resources because there are very many models. Jomo's country, they're small Petronas, small oil company Petronas is a global player now. But Malaysia cleverly used some of their petroleum wealth to support their agriculture, to build infrastructure and open up rural communities, to spur growth. So I've given you a very long answer. The political economy of the resource cost is complicated, but there's this interview I did using Sierra Leone as a case study. Just I think last month came out.
Okay.
Who wants to take the role of the private sector, harnessing the private sector? Oh.
I'd love to. Everything we talked about tonight is a pipe dream without the private sector. But that's not to say that we share the same interests as the private sector. There is no doubt that we have to weave the private sector into our work on every single one of the issues we've discussed tonight. But it is not a simple equation. If you're looking at the agriculture and the nutrition equation, different sets of actors. If you're looking at the climate change and maternal health equation, different set of actors. But there are some promising signs here. Let's just say we've been very much in the corporate social responsibility and philanthropic model. When we've talked about public-private partnerships, I would hear from most CEOs, they would say, you UN guys or you government guys, what you mean is you want us to give you money. That's not what we do. We make money. We don't give money. Now, what's interesting is we are moving into the era where actually we're getting out of strict philanthropy or corporate social responsibility and getting inside the business models of companies. Yes, they can make money, but can they do social good, do public good at the same time? And the overlap of those circles is actually quite large. We've probably leveraged a tiny fraction of it. Just to give you a couple examples, last week I was in London focused on getting corporations, large global corporations, to support women's and children's health. Only about half of the companies in the room actually had as their business something related to health or let's see, the big pharmaceutical companies. If you had a meeting on that subject 5 years ago, the only people in the room you would have had were the pharmaceutical companies. Now we had global logistics companies, to our questioner's background. We had consumer products companies. And one of the CEOs made a very interesting observation. He said, for so many years, we've only seen people in developing countries as consumers. If we wanted to work with you, it was because we wanted them to buy more of what we sell. We've slowly started to figure out they're also producers, and that there's a virtuous cycle. If we actually help you reduce maternal and child mortality, that the products that we sell and make actually are going to benefit from it. So we have to get inside their business models and not treat them as if they're donor agencies. We certainly should expect and use philanthropic money. That almost every major corporation has a philanthropic arm. They can do good that way. And we should hold them to standards through corporate social responsibility models, and the UN's Global Compact is exemplary in this regard. But it's getting inside the business models, using their day jobs to help advance the public good, and not just their philanthropic arms.
Okay, listen, we have to move on because we will have to vacate the room, and there is a much better reason to leave. There is wine and cheese waiting for you. So there are still lots of questions. Can we make the questions short and the answers short? Go ahead.
Okay, great. I will try. My name is Yannis. I'm a second-year graduate student at SIPA. So two brief questions, one on the political leadership in order to achieve the goals, and one on financing for development. I was working for Millennium Promise over the summer, the focal point for the U.S. Congress on the MDGs. So we basically briefed the U.S. Congress Committee on Foreign Affairs first time on
What's
the MDGs.
What's your question?
So so it's the U.S. We briefed them first time 5 years before the 2015 on the MDGs. How do we deal with wrong people, perhaps wrong people in the wrong positions? And the second question about financing for development. In the last G8 summit in Canada, I remember David Cameron, he was the only one pushing for to have a recommitment on the pledges on development in the final declaration. Nothing was appeared finally in the declaration. So my question is, do we expect the MDG summit in September to have a recommitment on these pledges on development?
Okay. Next.
My name is Alexander Ilchuk, and I'm alumnus of SIPA. And my questions relates to the UN coherence. We know that the effectiveness of progress and development depends on how different UN agencies will cooperate and coordinate among each other. So what is your vision for this question, and more specific question to Bob Orr on how you see the coordination of efforts between multilateral institutions and agencies who are involved in international development?
Next.
Hello, my name is Jamming. My question is for Mr. Yumkella. Having worked as a correspondent in West Africa for quite a while, my question, actually you've already answered half of my question. My question is, how can we ensure that the citizens in West Africa have access or have autonomy or control of their resources? Because from a past work experience, they don't.
Kandeh.
You may let the others answer the other questions while I think.
Okay, you think, but don't go to sleep. Yes.
Let's hear the others. Maybe we can
It's
wrap
a lot
up.
of questions. There are three already. We should answer them. Who wants
Okay.
to talk
I
about
can take.
the declaration? What's going to happen? Is it a real political commitment on development?
Down at that end.
Okay.
To me, no, that's yours. I will answer the UN coherence.
You're not usually a coward. Come on.
With respect to the UN coherence, that is a very good question. Just let me tell you that a lot has been happening in terms of restructuring the agencies to work together. I won't refer to that, but I would refer to the acceleration framework that is an interagency effort to look at the MDGs and have a roadmap for all the agencies on the ground. And the report just came out. It is called Unlocking Progress, of how we did that for the MDGs in specific countries. So really a lot is happening. We are doing much more together. It's not an easy task because we are many agencies and many actors on the ground. But really I think that the UN has become much better, more coherent, and much more doing together with respect to each mandate of the agency. So just to give that message.
Well, debatable. Bob?
Quick word on the political commitment side. Obviously, rhetorical commitments are not enough, but they are important to make sure that you put people on record. We are having a serious debate about accountability, and it's getting much more real than it used to be. But you realize how real it's getting when governments get up to the gate and they pull back. They really don't want to have excessively stringent, excessively clear, excessively detailed accountability frameworks. They don't want an agency to be able to come in and check the books and see what was delivered and was it double counted. But the fact is that we're getting much more specific on accountability in parts of the MDG world. I think we have to take this incrementally. If we can build accountability models that work in some areas, we can maybe transfer them into others. I think the idea that we're going to have one big macro accountability framework and hold everyone accountable top to bottom with every goal, it's very clear that many governments are just not ready for that. So we have to kind of push it, but we have to push it in a smart way. On the question of the UN cooperation with multilateral development agencies, and in particular, I assume you mean the multilateral development banks. I think here is there's an old story, which is kind of UN, World Bank, or multilateral development bank competition. We've actually figured out in more and more areas ways that we can collaborate using our relative comparative advantages. We also have spectacular failures still. What happened in Haiti, and I'm afraid Rebeca knows this as well as probably anyone in the, I was going to say in the room, probably in the world. In Haiti, there was such a natural potential collaboration between the United Nations and the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank. It just didn't come together. And I think that's something that if we are to actually address this range of issues, we need the staying power and the money that the multilateral development banks have. But we have presence on the ground. We deal with the peace and security issues that if you're not going to achieve any of the MDGs if the country's at war. You're just not going to achieve them. So there are synergies that we have to realize. One final word, you mentioned talking to the U.S. Congress. I've had the dubious distinction of working on both sides of the U.S. fence and trying to work with my country's Congress. For most people at the UN, you just stay as far away as possible from the U.S. Congress, and that's where everyone's happy. Unfortunately, the bad habits of the U.S. Congress have been learned by many, many governments now, and many parliaments around the world, that are all about trying to get intrusive in the management of global affairs in the UN and micromanaging, but are not ready to put up the resources to make the global goods available. But I think here we have to be on our game, but we need everyone to kind of, when you talk about accountability, we want actually legislatures in the game, because everything we're talking about requires ongoing financing, and you don't get that just out of an executive arms in most countries. You actually need to get into the pockets of those who have the money and make those decisions. So as hard as the U.S. Congress is, unfortunately, it's a school that we all need to learn in, because we're now doing that with multiple governments, and it is the wave of the future. So as much as you will hear superheated rhetoric out of the U.S. campaign and some of the people who will come through the U.S. elections in November, and believe me, the UN will be a target for many of those people who come through those elections. If it were just a U.S. phenomenon, I would rest a little easier. It won't be. We're starting to see this from various parts of the world. So we have to both defend ourselves on the facts and defend ourselves aggressively with a record that stands scrutiny.
Okay. The Secretary General used to say that the UN is the SG, and that means the scapegoat. It has always been there, will always be there. So, back to you.
My name is Leila Makrachi. I'm an alumni from SIPA. My question is actually regarding crisis countries. You mentioned Haiti, or Pakistan after the floods. I'd like to know what specific mechanisms can be implemented specifically in crisis countries, so that the progress of the MDGs is not lost but carried forward. Thank you.
My name is James Aniyamzala from Uganda, the 2010 Human Rights Advocate of Columbia University. My question is about inclusion of people with disability within the UN programs. 650 million people worldwide are people with disabilities, and they are no longer objects of charity, but rights holders. How are the programs of the UN that you are operating working towards inclusion of people with disability within the Millennium Development Goals? And two, this is a recommendation that there is a need for Millennium Development Goals disability monitoring indicators for the next 5 years to evaluate how various programs that are tending towards achieving Millennium Development Goals are including people with disability, who are the most vulnerable. When we talk about women with disabilities, they are the most vulnerable by the virtue of their disability and virtue of their being women. And same applies to the young people. I'll give an example. I used to walk 2 kilometers. I have a disability, a hearing disability, to go to school during my primary. But there was a neighbor of mine who needed a wheelchair. She was a young girl, but she couldn't manage. Up to now, she has never gone to school. That confirms with the UNICEF report that 98% of children with disability are not going to school. So there is a need, a special focus for us to focus on the inclusion of people with disability, more especially when we are reviewing these Millennium Development Goals.
Okay,
my last question, my last appeal is, I will use this opportunity to appeal to all stakeholders, including Columbia University, to make commitment towards capacity building of people with disabilities, so that we see catalyze the achievement of Millennium Development Goals. Thank you so much.
Thank you. We take all the last questions. Go ahead.
Good evening. My name is Fabian. I'm a current SIPA student. Mr. Yumkella touched briefly upon the topic already, but basically, as most of the panelists are pretty pessimistic about achieving the Millennium Development Goals by 2015, what is the strategy for beyond 2015, basically Millennium Development Goals 2.0? So what is if there are already plans on the way, and how do those plans look like?
Hi, Dirk Nyhart from United Nations Association in Berkeley, California. My question is, can you take this on a roadshow? People in Geneva, Nairobi, Vienna, the whole world needs to hear you global leaders.
Thank you. Last question, you have the last word.
Last question. My name is Yulia Vnukova, first year MIA student. Just ended my actually employment at the UN, probably it's a break. My question is, in the light of the upcoming private sector forum at the UN, what's the your take on the financial innovations? What's the UN's role on the, what are the innovations for the financing for development the MDG can bring in? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. One crisis country and MDG, how can we prevent UNDP?
Crisis countries. Yeah. Let me be very candid on this one because there are crisis countries in which really we have the right programs in terms of targeting the MDGs because there is a minimum of a framework. But really when you don't have a minimum of a framework, we have to admit that the difficulties that we are facing in terms, for example, of security, of putting people on the ground, etc., are really huge. So I don't want to be here like over-optimistic in the sense that there are certain countries where we won't see, unless we tackle the root of the crisis and the problem of the political instability, we won't see great advances on the MDGs. So our first target is really to stabilize the country, to be able to build a dialogue within society for that to be able to happen. So that will be the first target, to be able to go on the MDGs. It's not the MDGs in themselves, but to be able to reestablish the rule of law, a peaceful path for development, so the preconditions for the MDGs will be set. There are other crisis countries where crisis is very focused, is very targeted in several parts of the country. So really, you can see in some of them great advances for the MDGs, and we have been seeing improvement on them. So what I will, Pakistan is not the same as an armed conflict. Okay, so we are not talking about the same. In Pakistan, we have a crisis because of a climate event that have affected many 20 million people. And we have the instruments there to be able to be more helpful, to try to preclude a backlash on the MDGs. But it's different in the countries where you have an open armed conflict, where the main target should be to achieve peace and stability. So these are two totally different ways of intervening depending on the specific situation. Let me just take then the problem of people with disabilities. And let me say that a great thing has happened with the Convention for People with Disabilities. And this is a convention that has been approved in many of the Congress of the world. The problem we have now is how you take the convention into the legal frameworks and programs of the country. And we are precisely discussing to be able to put together a multi-donor trust fund, to be able to finance within the countries, not only the approval of the convention, but the coherence of the convention with the framework of laws that don't consider that at all, or the mainstreaming of the program in the judicial systems, for example, or in all what the UN does. That is how you mainstream the disability problem in all the projects. And we are precisely working in this second phase The first phase was a phase of advocacy, of making the convention known and approved by the countries. Now the problem is how you make that framework, that international framework, coherent with what is happening in the countries in terms of the rule of law and of the legal framework. And we are precisely on that stage. So a long way to go in that road, but a very good start with the Convention on Disabilities that was approved in the framework of the UN.
I would like to conclude this panel by asking each speaker to tell us in very few words what they would like to see next week. If there were one thing they would like to see happening among the 83 events and the declaration, the outcome document, what is it? Bob.
What I want to see is specific announcements of concrete partnerships between partners that cross the lines, that are not just governments with governments, but governments with private sector, with NGOs, because on the question of accountability and delivery, if you have partnerships with people from other sectors, the pressure on you to actually deliver is much greater, because the accountabilities for a company, an NGO, and a government and an international organization are very different. So I think the rubber will meet the road the more concrete partnerships are formed and announced around specific issues. I think we'll see a lot more delivery down the road.
I'm record because I'm going to say the same thing again on the sexual and reproductive health and rights for girls and women. But I also agree very much with what Bob said, is the accountability for everybody. That's just not there. And I think we need to find a way, not a global governance, in a sense of a government, but a global governance system that really is accountable. And I think we are a long way from that.
I think a reaffirmation of their commitment and willingness to finance these, what Bob referred to earlier, minimum commitments that were made 10 years ago. Because some of us worry that other emerging problems will shift attention from this unfinished business. We have to solve this, so we want a recommitment, and for sure, selfishly, I hope energy becomes prominent.
My wish is almost certainly not going to be realized, but early last year, the Secretary General announced a call for a global Green New Deal. I believe we have a number of problems which can be addressed together. We spoke earlier about the food crisis, the energy crisis problems. We have a problem of development more generally, and then to compound it all, we have the financial crisis. And we have what might be called a Bretton Woods moment. I think we have lost it, but we had the possibility of the international community coming together to address the challenges which we face in the world together. If we look back at the original New Deal at Roosevelt, he created basically about 2 million jobs in a country which was about 1/3 of the current size of the United States. 2 million jobs were created through something called the Citizens Conservation Corps. And it was about infrastructure, but it was also about the environment, the national park system, and a whole range of other things. We had the opportunity to address the climate problem by a major thrust in producing much more renewable energy, and through a number of other creative solutions dealing with the problems of food agriculture and so on and so forth. All this could have been done if we sensed the moment and we saw the opportunity. The alternatives, unfortunately, are not promising. I mean, if you think of what got us out of the Depression, it was World War II. Surely there are alternatives today to military Keynesianism, and I wish the international community had the kind of confidence which was there at the birth of the UN. Bretton Woods Conference was the United Nations Conference on Monetary and Financial Affairs, even though the United Nations did not exist at that time. It was a statement of commitment on the part of President Roosevelt, which I wish there was today in the international community, which would allow us to address all these problems together. Unfortunately, my wish is not going to be realized.
But you have to dream of what you can't have.
Well, what I wish is not to lose the momentum, to sustain and accelerate progress. And I think that that needs what my colleagues have said, re-energize the commitments and have a framework for accountability. And that's my wish.
Thank you very much. I want to thank all the speakers and all the students who have patiently listened to them. And I hope you will keep really informed of what is going to happen next week at the United Nations. Lots of press releases are going to come out. You could do nothing but read the news, I'm sure, next week. So thank you again for coming, all of you.